The seamstress's pattern. The needle slipped through Isabella Chen's finger as she bent over the elaborate wedding dress, sending drops of blood onto the pristine white silk that had taken her 6 months to create. But it wasn't pain from the wound that made her hands shake. It was the realization that she was stitching the bridal gown for her own sister's wedding to the man who'd murdered their parents 5 years ago. Maria Chen stood motionless on the fitting platform, radiant in the dress that represented everything Isabella had sacrificed to create: reputation, artistry, and the future she'd planned before discovering that the charming railroad executive who was courting her sister was actually Vincent Blackwood, the same man who'd orchestrated the explosion that had killed Chen family and stolen their mining claims throughout California territory. "Isabella, you're bleeding on my dress," Maria said without turning around, her voice carrying the cold indifference that had replaced the warmth they'd once shared as sisters. "Perhaps you should be more careful with your needlework." "But what?" Maria didn't know. What none of the wedding guests would know when they gathered at San Francisco's most exclusive church tomorrow morning was that Isabella Chen wasn't just creating a bridal gown. She was stitching evidence into every scene, documenting proof of Vincent Blackwood's crimes in places where it would survive even if she didn't live to see him prosecuted. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of more than just fashion design. It was a carefully constructed map of territorial corruption, with each bead and thread positioned to reveal the locations of mass graves, stolen gold, and government officials who'd been purchased with Chinese immigrant blood. Isabella had spent 5 years planning this moment, transforming herself from a grieving daughter into the territory's most skilled seamstress, while secretly documenting the conspiracy that had murdered her parents and hundreds of other Chinese families. Tomorrow's wedding would either expose Vincent Blackwood's crimes or become Isabella's own funeral shroud. But either way, the pattern she'd woven into Maria's dress would tell the truth about systematic genocide disguised as territorial development. But to understand how a Chinese-American seamstress became the architect of the most elaborate revenge plot in California territory history, we need to go back to the day 12-year-old Isabella discovered that her parents' death in a mining accident was actually the opening move in a campaign to eliminate Chinese immigrants and steal the gold claims they'd worked so hard to develop. Hangtown, California, 1878. 12-year-old Isabella Chen knelt beside her parents' grave in the Chinese section of Hangtown Cemetery, carefully arranging the white chrysanthemums she'd grown in the small garden behind their house. 2 weeks had passed since the mining accident that had killed Chen Wei-ming and his wife Li Mei-hua, along with 14 other Chinese miners who'd been working the Golden Dragon claim when an explosion collapsed 3 tunnel sections simultaneously. The territorial investigation had concluded that the explosion was caused by improper storage of blasting powder, combined with structural weaknesses in tunnel supports that should have been replaced months earlier. According to mining safety officials, the Chinese workers had been inadequately trained in explosive handling and had ignored established safety protocols, making the accident both predictable and preventable. But Isabella knew her parents' work habits, and she understood enough about mining operations to recognize problems with the official explanation. Her father had been one of the most experienced miners in California, having worked gold claims for over 15 years without a serious accident. He was obsessive about safety procedures and had taught Isabella to identify dangerous conditions in mines from the time she was old enough to walk through tunnel entrances. More importantly, her father had mentioned concerns about sabotage at the Golden Dragon claim during the weeks before the explosion. Equipment had been tampered with, safety systems had been mysteriously disabled, and there had been late-night meetings between mine supervisors and men who didn't appear to have legitimate business at the operation. Chun Wei-ming had been planning to report these irregularities to territorial mining authorities when the explosion occurred, eliminating both him and the other Chinese miners who'd witnessed the suspicious activities. As Isabella arranged flowers on her parents' grave, she was joined by Mrs. Sarah Morrison, the widow of a Scottish miner who'd been killed in a similar explosion 6 months earlier. Mrs. Morrison had taken a protective interest in Isabella and her 15-year-old sister Maria, helping them navigate territorial legal system and ensuring they received the small compensation payments that territorial law provided to families of deceased miners. "Isabella, dear, how are you managing? I know how difficult this must be for you and Maria." "We're surviving, Mrs. Morrison. Maria has been working at the hotel, and I've been doing sewing for some of the ladies in town." Mrs. Morrison studied Isabella's face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to recognize signs of hidden knowledge and suppressed anger. "Isabella, is there something troubling you about your parents' death? Something beyond the natural grief of losing family?" Isabella looked around the cemetery to make sure they weren't being observed, then decided to trust the woman who'd been kind to her family during their most difficult period. "Mrs. Morrison, my father told me that there were strange things happening at the mine before the explosion. People who shouldn't have been there, equipment that had been tampered with, safety systems that stopped working for no apparent reason." "And you think the explosion wasn't an accident?" "I think someone wanted the Chinese miners dead, and they made it look like an accident to avoid investigation." Mrs. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the graves of miners who'd died in what territorial officials claimed were separate, unrelated accidents. "Isabella, my husband told me similar things before he died. Equipment failures, safety problems that appeared suddenly, meetings between mine supervisors and people he didn't recognize." Mrs. Morrison's voice dropped barely above a whisper. "But when I tried to report these concerns to territorial authorities, I was told that immigrant miners often created conspiracy theories to explain accidents that were caused by their own carelessness." Isabella felt anger building in her chest as she understood that Mrs. Morrison had tried to investigate her husband's death and had been dismissed by officials who didn't want to hear evidence that contradicted their preferred explanations. "Mrs. Morrison, what if we could prove that these accidents weren't accidents? What if we could find evidence that someone was deliberately killing miners?" "Isabella, that would be very dangerous work. If someone is powerful enough to commit murder and cover it up through official investigations, they're powerful enough to eliminate people who ask uncomfortable questions." Isabella looked at her parents' grave, thinking about the lives they'd built through hard work and careful savings, and about the future they'd planned for their daughters before someone decided the Chinese miners were more valuable dead than alive. "Mrs. Morrison, what if we were careful? What if we investigated quietly, gathering evidence that could eventually be used to expose the people responsible?" Mrs. Morrison studied Isabella's face, probably wondering if a 12-year-old girl could handle the kind of work that would be required to build cases against powerful people who'd perfected the art of legal murder. "Isabella, that kind of investigation would require skills and resources that we don't have. We'd need access to mining records, territorial government documents, and information about business relationships that connect mining operations to territorial officials. But we have something else, Mrs. Morrison. We have time, patience, and the ability to observe things that powerful people don't expect ordinary women to notice." "What do you mean?" Isabella stood and brushed dirt from her hands, her mind already working through the possibilities of a long-term investigation that could expose systematic murder disguised as mining accidents. I mean that women like us, widows and orphans who do domestic work for wealthy families, have access to places and conversations that men don't notice. We can learn things about their business activities, their personal relationships, and their plans for future operations. Mrs. Morrison looked intrigued by Isabella's suggestion, but also concerned about the implications of what she was proposing. Isabella, you're talking about becoming spies in the houses of people who might be murderers. That's extremely dangerous work for anyone, but especially for a Chinese girl who would be viewed with suspicion if she asked too many questions. Not if I was just a seamstress who was interested in creating beautiful clothing for wealthy women. Not if I was someone who had legitimate reasons to visit their homes and observe their activities. Isabella's plan was beginning to take shape as she spoke, building on skills she'd already developed and opportunities that were available to someone willing to work patiently toward long-term goals. Mrs. Morrison, I'm already skilled at sewing and embroidery. If I could develop those skills further, I could establish a reputation as the finest seamstress in California territory. Wealthy women would compete to hire me, which would give me access to their homes, their conversations, and their husbands' business activities. And while you were creating clothing for these women, you'd be gathering information about their husbands' involvement in mining operations and territorial politics. Exactly. But I'd also be doing something else. I'd be documenting everything I learned in places where it would survive even if something happened to me. Mrs. Morrison's expression sharpened with interest. What kind of documentation? Isabella smiled as the full scope of her plan crystallized in her mind. The kind that wealthy women wear to important social events, where it would be preserved and displayed for everyone to see. Over the following years, Isabella Chen transformed herself from a grieving orphan into the most sought-after seamstress in California territory. She developed techniques for embroidering designs that looked decorative but actually contained coded information about criminal activities she'd witnessed or overheard. She learned to create garments that contained hidden compartments where documents could be concealed, and she established relationships with wealthy women who trusted her with confidential information about their husbands' business activities. But most importantly, Isabella learned to read the patterns of territorial corruption that connected mining accidents, land acquisitions, and political appointments in ways that revealed the systematic nature of crimes against Chinese immigrants and other marginalized communities. By 1883, Isabella had documented evidence that dozens of mining accidents had been deliberately caused to eliminate Chinese workers and allow territorial officials to seize valuable claims through fraudulent legal proceedings. She'd identified the network of businessmen, judges, and government officials who profited from these activities, and she'd gathered evidence that could be used to prosecute everyone involved in the conspiracy. But Isabella had also discovered something that transformed her investigation from a quest for justice into a race for survival. The same criminal network that had murdered her parents was planning to eliminate all Chinese immigrants from California territory through a systematic campaign of violence, theft, and legal persecution. The plan was scheduled to begin with a series of race riots that would provide cover for mass murder, followed by territorial legislation that would strip Chinese immigrants of property rights and legal protections. Vincent Blackwood, who'd emerged as the leader of the conspiracy, had already begun courting Isabella's sister Maria as part of a plan to gain control of Chinese community leadership, and eliminate potential resistance to the upcoming pogrom. Isabella realized that her careful, patient investigation was about to become irrelevant if she couldn't find a way to expose the conspiracy before it eliminated everyone who could testify about the crimes that had already been committed. Her solution was audacious, dangerous, and perfectly suited to her skills as a seamstress who'd spent 5 years learning to hide truth in places where powerful people would never think to look for it. Isabella was going to use Vincent Blackwood's wedding to Maria as an opportunity to reveal evidence of his crimes in front of the territorial officials, business leaders, and journalists who would be attending what was expected to be the social event of the decade. The wedding dress she was creating for Maria wasn't just elaborate bridal wear. It was a carefully constructed exhibition of documentary evidence that would expose systematic genocide. The moment Maria walked down the aisle of San Francisco's most prestigious church, Vincent Blackwood thought he was marrying into the Chinese community to gain control of potential resistance to his plans. Instead, he was about to provide Isabella with the perfect platform for revealing crimes that would destroy his conspiracy and protect the hundreds of Chinese families who were targeted for elimination. The pattern Isabella had been stitching for 5 years was finally coming together, but the final design would either save her community or result in her death at the hands of men who'd perfected the art of making murder look like accident. Maria's wedding day was less than 24 hours away, and Isabella was putting the finishing touches on a masterpiece that would transform a celebration of love into an exhibition of evidence that could change the course of territorial history. But first, she had to survive long enough to see Vincent Blackwood's reaction when he realized that his bride was wearing documentation of his crimes to their wedding ceremony. The afternoon before the wedding, Isabella made her final preparations, while Maria submitted to the last fitting of her elaborate bridal gown. The dress was a technical masterpiece, requiring 6 months of careful work to complete. But Isabella had used every hour of that time to embed evidence of Vincent Blackwood's crimes into the garment's construction. The beadwork along the bodice wasn't just decorative, it was a coded map showing the locations of mass graves where Chinese miners had been buried after being murdered in staged mining accidents. The embroidered flowers on the skirt contained the names and dates of death for over 200 victims of Vincent's conspiracy, stitched in thread that would fluoresce under certain lighting conditions. Most importantly, the dress's elaborate train contained detailed documentation of financial transactions, government bribes, and territorial legislation that had been purchased with Chinese immigrant blood. Isabella had spent months learning to create threads so fine that entire documents could be embroidered into fabric in ways that looked like decorative patterns to casual observation. But the dress also contained something else, a complete confession written in Isabella's own hand, explaining her investigation methods and providing instructions for accessing additional evidence she'd hidden throughout the territory. If Vincent Blackwood killed her during or after the wedding ceremony, the dress would serve as her final testimony against the man who'd murdered her parents and hundreds of other innocent people. As Isabella made final adjustments to the dress's fit, she tried one last time to warn her sister about the man she was planning to marry. "Maria, are you certain you want to go through with this wedding? You've known Vincent for less than a year, and there are things about him that you might not understand." Maria Chen studied her reflection in the full-length mirror, admiring the way the elaborate wedding dress transformed her from a hotel worker into someone who belonged in San Francisco's highest society. "Isabella, Vincent Blackwood is the most successful businessman in California territory. He's offering me a life of wealth and respectability, that I could never achieve on my own. But what if that wealth comes from activities that hurt other people? What if Vincent isn't the honorable man you think he is? Maria turned to face her sister directly, her expression showing the hardness that had developed during 5 years of working to survive in a territory that offered few opportunities for Chinese women. Isabella, I don't care how Vincent earned his money. I care that he has it, and that he's willing to share it with someone like me. After what happened to our parents, I'm not going to waste time worrying about other people's moral judgments. Isabella realized that her sister had made a conscious choice to ignore evidence about Vincent's character and criminal activities, because the alternative, remaining poor and powerless in a hostile territory, seemed worse than marrying a murderer. Maria, what if I could prove that Vincent was involved in our parents' death? Would that change your mind about marrying him? Maria's expression didn't change, but Isabella saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. Isabella, our parents are dead. Nothing we do now will bring them back or change what happened to them. But marrying Vincent will ensure that we never have to worry about survival again, even if it means becoming complicit in the same crimes that killed our family, especially if it means never being vulnerable to those crimes again. Isabella understood that her sister had chosen security over justice, wealth over integrity. Maria knew exactly who Vincent Blackwood was and what he'd done, but she'd decided that marrying him was preferable to fighting him. But Isabella also understood something else. Maria's decision to marry Vincent provided the perfect opportunity to expose his crimes in a way that would destroy his conspiracy while protecting the Chinese community from his planned pogrom. Maria, I respect your decision about Vincent, but I need you to understand that this dress contains more than just beautiful needlework. What do you mean? Isabella gestured toward the elaborate beadwork and embroidery that covered every inch of the wedding gown. I mean that everything I've learned about Vincent's activities over the past 5 years has been documented in places where it will survive even if something happens to me. Maria stared at her sister with dawning understanding. You've turned my wedding dress into evidence against my future husband. I've turned your wedding dress into protection for our community. When you walk down that aisle tomorrow, you'll be carrying proof of crimes that could destroy Vincent's conspiracy and save hundreds of lives. And if Vincent discovers what you've done... Isabella met her sister's gaze directly, her voice steady, despite the fear that had been building in her chest for months. Then I'll die knowing that his crimes have been exposed, and that the people he planned to murder will be protected by evidence that no one can destroy or suppress. Maria was quiet for several minutes, studying her reflection in the mirror while considering the implications of what Isabella had told her. Isabella, do you really believe that Vincent killed our parents? I know that Vincent killed our parents along with hundreds of other Chinese immigrants. I have documentation, witness testimony, and financial records that prove his involvement in systematic murder disguised as mining accidents. And you're planning to reveal this evidence during my wedding ceremony? I'm planning to ensure that this evidence survives, regardless of what happens to me. Your wedding provides the perfect opportunity to place that evidence where it will be preserved and eventually discovered by people who can act on it. Maria turned away from the mirror to face Isabella directly. And what about me? What happens to me when Vincent discovers that his wife is wearing evidence of his crimes? Isabella had been dreading this question because she knew that her plan would put Maria in mortal danger, regardless of her sister's knowledge or cooperation. Maria, Vincent is planning to eliminate all Chinese immigrants from California territory, starting with a series of riots that will provide cover for mass murder. Whether you marry him or not, whether you know about his crimes or not, you're already targeted for elimination because you're Chinese. So my choice is between dying as Vincent's enemy or dying as his wife. Your choice is between dying as an ignorant victim or surviving as someone who helped expose the conspiracy that threatens our entire community." Maria walked to the window, overlooking San Francisco's busy streets, watching ordinary people go about their daily business, while she decided whether to become complicit in her sister's plan for justice. "Isabella, if I agree to help you, what exactly would you need me to do?" "Nothing that would put you in additional danger. Just wear the dress, participate in the ceremony, and trust that the evidence I've embedded will eventually be discovered by people who can use it. And if Vincent realizes what you've done before the evidence can be found—" Isabella pulled a small derringer from her sewing kit, checking its load with practiced efficiency. "Then I'll make sure he doesn't live long. Enough to eliminate the witnesses who could testify about his crimes." Maria stared at the weapon in her sister's hands, understanding finally that Isabella had spent 5 years preparing for war against the man who destroyed their family. "You're planning to kill him at my wedding?" "I'm planning to protect our community by any means necessary. If that requires killing Vincent Blackwood in front of 500 wedding guests, then that's what I'll do." Maria nodded slowly, her expression showing the same hardness that had allowed her to accept Vincent's proposal, despite knowing what he was. "Then let's make sure this wedding gives our community the protection it needs, regardless of the personal cost." The sisters spent the rest of the evening making final preparations for what would either be Maria's wedding or Vincent Blackwood's execution, but which would definitely be the day when Isabella's 5-year investigation finally revealed truth about systematic genocide in California territory. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with San Francisco's social elite gathering at St. Mary's Cathedral to witness what society newspapers had described as the most elaborate wedding ceremony in California territory history. Vincent Blackwood had spared no expense in creating a spectacle that would demonstrate his wealth, power, and social standing to the territorial officials and business leaders whose support he needed for his planned pogrom against Chinese immigrants. Isabella arrived at the cathedral early, ostensibly to help Maria prepare for the ceremony, but actually to make final preparations for revealing evidence that would destroy Vincent's conspiracy. She'd spent the morning placing additional documentation in strategic locations throughout the cathedral, ensuring that evidence of Vincent's crimes would be discovered even if her primary plan failed. But Isabella had also prepared for the possibility that Vincent would discover her activities and attempt to eliminate her before the evidence could be revealed. She'd positioned allies throughout the cathedral, Chinese community members who'd been secretly documenting territorial persecution of immigrants, and she'd arranged signals that would trigger multiple backup plans if her main strategy was compromised. As wedding guests began arriving, Isabella recognized faces from 5 years of investigation, territorial judges who'd accepted bribes to rule against Chinese plaintiffs, mining company executives who'd ordered murders disguised as accidents, government officials who'd falsified safety reports to cover up systematic genocide. These men thought they were attending a social celebration that would mark Vincent Blackwood's complete integration into California territory's power structure. Instead, they were about to witness the revelation of evidence that would destroy their careers and send many of them to federal prison. Maria appeared in the cathedral's bridal preparation room, exactly on schedule, radiant in the wedding dress that had taken Isabella 6 months to complete. The elaborate gown was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with beadwork and embroidery so intricate that many guests would spend years discovering new details in the patterns Isabella had created. But the most important details wouldn't be discovered by casual observation. They would be found by federal investigators who'd been secretly contacted by Isabella and who were already waiting in the cathedral to document whatever revelations emerged from the day's activities. As Maria took her position at the end of the cathedral's main aisle, Isabella felt the weight of 5 years of planning and preparation focusing on the next few minutes. Everything depended on timing, coordination, and the willingness of federal authorities to act on evidence that could expose systematic genocide perpetrated by some of California Territory's most powerful citizens. Vincent Blackwood took his position at the altar, dressed in expensive formal wear and surrounded by groomsmen who included territorial officials and business leaders who'd profited from his criminal activities. He looked confident, powerful, and completely unaware that he was about to be exposed as a mass murderer in front of 500 witnesses. The wedding ceremony began with traditional vows and religious rituals that provided cover for Isabella's final preparations. She'd positioned herself in the front pew where she could observe both the wedding party and the federal agents, who were documenting everything through concealed photography equipment. But as the ceremony progressed toward the moment when Maria would walk down the aisle in her evidence-laden dress, Isabella noticed something that made her blood run cold. Vincent Blackwood wasn't watching his bride with the expression of a man in love. He was studying her dress with the calculating attention of someone who recognized that the elaborate patterns contained more than just decorative needlework. Isabella realized that Vincent had discovered her plan, probably through surveillance of her activities or through informants who'd observed her research over the past 5 years. He knew that Maria's wedding dress contained evidence of his crimes, and he was preparing to eliminate both sisters before that evidence could be revealed to federal authorities. The wedding ceremony was about to become a battlefield, with Isabella and Maria trapped at the center of a confrontation between federal agents seeking to expose territorial genocide and criminals who were prepared to commit mass murder to protect their conspiracy. Isabella's 5-year investigation was about to reach its climax, but the outcome would depend on whether federal authorities could act quickly enough to prevent Vincent Blackwood from eliminating the witnesses and evidence that could destroy his criminal empire. As Maria began walking down the aisle toward what might be her execution rather than her wedding, Isabella prepared to implement the most dangerous phase of a plan that would either expose systematic genocide or result in the deaths of everyone who'd tried to stop it. The pattern she'd been stitching for 5 years was finally complete, but the final design would be written in blood on the marble floor of San Francisco's most prestigious cathedral. As Maria walked slowly down the cathedral aisle, her elaborate train spreading behind her like a river of silk and secrets, Isabella noticed movement among Vincent Blackwood's groomsmen that had nothing to do with wedding ceremony protocols. 3 of the men had positioned themselves near exits, their hands resting inside their formal coats in ways that suggested concealed weapons. Another 2 had moved to flank the altar, creating a protective formation around Vincent that would allow them to control the area where vows were being exchanged. Isabella realized that Vincent had planned to eliminate her and Maria during the wedding ceremony itself, probably making their deaths look like an attack by Chinese radicals who were opposed to interracial marriage. The story would fit perfectly, with his planned pogrom against Chinese immigrants providing additional justification for the systematic violence he was preparing to unleash throughout California Territory. But Isabella had also noticed something else during her careful observation of the cathedral. Several men in the congregation weren't watching the bride with the interested attention typical of wedding guests. Instead, they were studying the positions of Vincent's men while maintaining their own strategic positioning throughout the church. Federal agents had infiltrated the wedding ceremony and were preparing to act on the evidence Isabella had promised to provide. As Maria reached the altar and took her position beside Vincent, Isabella stood and moved toward the front of the cathedral, ostensibly to arrange the bridal train, but actually to position herself where she could signal federal agents if Vincent's men began reaching for their weapons. The ceremony proceeded through traditional vows and religious rituals, with the officiant speaking about love, commitment, and the sacred bonds of marriage, while Isabella and Vincent's men prepared for violence that could erupt at any moment. The contrast between the ceremony's peaceful facade and the deadly tension underneath created an atmosphere that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing danger without understanding its source. When the officiant reached the point where objections to the marriage were traditionally requested, Isabella made her move. "I object to this marriage," she announced in a voice that carried clearly throughout the cathedral, "and I have evidence that the groom has committed crimes that make him unworthy of marrying anyone." The congregation erupted into confused murmur as Isabella walked to the altar carrying a portfolio that contained the most damning evidence from her 5-year investigation. Vincent's men began reaching for their weapons, but they found themselves facing drawn guns from federal agents who'd been positioned throughout the cathedral, specifically to prevent violence during the revelation of evidence. "Vincent Blackwood," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger as she opened the portfolio, "you are guilty of murdering my parents and hundreds of other Chinese immigrants through staged mining accidents designed to steal their claims and eliminate witnesses to your criminal activities." Vincent's expression shifted from wedding day happiness to cold calculation as he realized that his conspiracy had been exposed in front of 500 witnesses, including journalists who were already taking notes for stories that would spread across the nation within hours. "Miss Chen, you're disrupting a sacred ceremony with unfounded accusations based on grief and racial resentment," Vincent replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his explanations accepted without question. "I'm disrupting a criminal conspiracy with documented evidence of systematic genocide," Isabella countered, beginning to display photographs, financial records, and witness testimonies that detailed 5 years of research into territorial corruption and mass murder. "Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the congregation directly, "the wedding dress my sister is wearing contains a complete record of Vincent Blackwood's crimes, embedded in needlework that documents the murders of over 200 Chinese immigrants. Every bead represents a victim. Every embroidered flower contains a name and date of death. Every decorative pattern maps the locations of mass graves throughout California territory." The cathedral fell into stunned silence as wedding guests realized they were witnessing the exposure of crimes that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Many of the men present were implicated in Isabella's evidence, and they began calculating whether to flee, fight, or attempt to discredit her revelations before federal authorities could act on them. Vincent Blackwood made his choice by drawing a concealed pistol and aiming it at Isabella's chest. "Miss Chen, you've created an elaborate fiction based on coincidences and cultural misunderstandings. No one will believe accusations made by a Chinese seamstress against respected territorial officials. They'll believe documentation created over 5 years of careful investigation," Isabella replied, not moving despite the weapon pointed at her heart. "And they'll believe the testimony of federal agents who have been monitoring your activities while I gathered evidence of your crimes." Vincent's expression changed as he realized that federal authorities had been involved in Isabella's investigation. From the beginning, his conspiracy wasn't being exposed by an amateur seeking personal revenge. It was being dismantled by professional investigators who'd been building prosecutable cases against everyone involved in systematic genocide. "Federal agents," announced a voice from the congregation, "you are all under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violations of federal treaties protecting immigrant populations." U.S. Marshal Harrison Cole stood and displayed his badge while dozens of other federal agents revealed their positions throughout the cathedral. Vincent Blackwood and his co-conspirators found themselves surrounded by law enforcement officers who'd been waiting for exactly this moment to make arrests that would dismantle the largest criminal conspiracy in California Territory history. Vincent lowered his weapon, understanding that resistance would only add to the charges he was already facing based on Isabella's evidence. But his expression showed rage rather than defeat as he stared at the young woman who'd spent 5 years planning his destruction. "Miss Chen, you've made a terrible mistake. There are forces at work here that you don't understand, people with resources and connections that reach far beyond territorial government. This investigation will be suppressed, these arrests will be overturned, and everyone involved in exposing our activities will face consequences that make death seem merciful." Isabella smiled as she realized that Vincent still didn't understand the scope of the trap she'd constructed around him and his co-conspirators. "Mr. Blackwood, this investigation involves federal authorities, international observers, and journalists from newspapers throughout the United States and Europe. Your conspiracy has been exposed to people who can't be bribed, intimidated, or eliminated by territorial criminals." As federal agents began making arrests throughout the cathedral, Isabella turned to her sister, who was still standing at the altar in the wedding dress that had become evidence in the largest prosecution of territorial war crimes in American history. "Maria, I'm sorry your wedding day became something different than you planned. But I hope you understand that this was the only way to protect our community from systematic genocide." Maria Chen looked around the cathedral at the chaos of arrests, evidence gathering, and journalistic documentation that had replaced her wedding ceremony. When she turned back to Isabella, her expression showed understanding rather than anger. "Isabella, I knew what Vincent was when I agreed to marry him. I also knew what you were planning when I agreed to wear this dress." She gestured toward the elaborate gown that was already being examined by federal agents seeking evidence embedded in its construction. "I chose to help expose his crimes rather than become complicit in them." Isabella felt tears of relief and gratitude as she realized that her sister had been cooperating with her investigation rather than simply accepting circumstances beyond her control. The wedding ceremony had been a joint operation designed to expose Vincent's conspiracy while protecting both sisters from retaliation. Over the following months, the evidence Isabella had gathered led to the largest prosecution of territorial corruption and war crimes in American history. Vincent Blackwood and 43 co-conspirators were convicted of murder, conspiracy, and violations of federal treaties protecting immigrant populations. The trials revealed systematic genocide that had eliminated over 500 Chinese immigrants while stealing millions of dollars in gold claims and territorial resources. Vincent Blackwood was sentenced to hang for his crimes, with his execution attended by hundreds of Chinese immigrants whose families had been saved by Isabella's investigation. The conspiracy he'd led was completely dismantled, and federal legislation was passed to prevent similar crimes against immigrant populations throughout the Western territories. Isabella used her restored property rights and compensation from the federal prosecutions to establish the California Territory Immigrant Protection Foundation, which investigated persecution of minority communities and provided legal assistance to families fighting territorial discrimination and violence. She continued working as a seamstress throughout California, but her reputation had evolved from skilled craftswoman to hero who'd exposed systematic genocide through patient investigation and strategic revelation of evidence. Her techniques for embedding documentation in clothing and other artistic works became standard methods for protecting evidence from suppression or destruction. When Isabella Chen died in 1931, her funeral was attended by federal judges, immigrant rights advocates, and hundreds of people whose lives had been protected by her work, fighting systematic oppression through artistic integrity and strategic courage. The inscription on her tombstone, chosen by the Chinese American communities she'd helped protect, read, "She stitched truth into beautiful patterns and made justice visible to the world." But perhaps her most important legacy was the understanding that artistic skills could be powerful weapons against institutional oppression when combined with strategic thinking, moral courage, and the patience to work toward long-term goals rather than immediate gratification. Isabella Chen had transformed personal tragedy into systematic reform, using her needlework skills to create lasting protections against the kind of genocide that had targeted her parents and hundreds of other innocent families. The seamstress's pattern had become a template for using artistic integrity to fight corruption and criminal abuse of power, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective weapons against organized oppression were needle, thread, and the determination to stitch truth into places where it couldn't be hidden or destroyed. Vincent Blackwood had tried to use Isabella's sister as a tool for gaining control over the Chinese community he planned to eliminate. Instead, he'd provided Isabella with the perfect opportunity to expose his crimes and create protections that would prevent future genocides against immigrant populations throughout the American West. The pattern Isabella had been creating for 5 years was finally complete, and it would continue protecting vulnerable communities long after the woman who'd stitched it was gone.